15 years ago, I was sure I'd become an artist. Today, at 35, I find myself surrounded by lines of code instead of blank canvases. Life is full of ironies. As a software engineer, I learned that perfection is in the details, whether in an algorithm or the color of a garage. The promotion arrived with spring. I became the technical lead at the most promising startup in Silicon Valley. My daughter Emma said that now I was a robot boss. And in a way, she was right. The bigger salary meant we could finally start the renovations on the house we bought 6 months ago. I started with the garage. A simple project, I thought. A shade of gray that paired perfectly with our modern architecture. The HOA rules were clear, or so I believed. Little did I know that that can of paint would turn into a battle that would change not only my life, but the whole community's. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. The email arrived on a Monday, right in the middle of an important meeting about our new platform. Violation notice. Fine. $155,000. I read it 3 times to be sure that I wasn't hallucinating from too much coffee. Apparently, the shade of gray on my garage was 3 levels darker than allowed by Code 7.3.2 of the HOA regulations. I slammed my laptop shut in the middle of the presentation and rushed home. On the way, I received 5 calls from the HOA secretary, all in that monotone robotic voice. "Mr. Thompson, President Margaret Walker requests your immediate presence." I parked in front of my supposedly criminal garage. Some neighbors drove by slowly, giving me side glances like I'd committed a federal crime. Mrs. Peterson from number 42 even crossed herself when she saw me. Standing on my sidewalk was a woman with perfectly styled hair and an impeccable beige blazer. It was Margaret Walker herself, holding her gold clipboard and a digital color meter. "Mr. Thompson, I'm afraid we have a serious compliance issue here," she said, not even meeting my eyes. I tried to explain that I had consulted the manual before picking the color. I showed her before and after photos on my phone, the paint specifications, everything. Margaret just shook her head like she was dealing with a stubborn child. "Rules exist for a reason, Mr. Thompson. This fine reflects the seriousness of the violation. We have standards to uphold." She turned on her heel and walked off, leaving behind an aura of expensive perfume and toxic authority. I returned to the office stunned, with an astronomical bill to pay, and a growing feeling that something very wrong was happening in this neighborhood. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried to juggle my new company responsibilities alongside this absurd situation. I spent my lunch breaks solving the problem, sending emails, making calls, and trying to schedule meetings with the HOA management. Margaret was evasive with impressive skill. Her secretary always had a new excuse. "He's out on an inspection," in a meeting with the board, evaluating violations at other properties. Meanwhile, the deadline for appeals was shrinking by the day. I finally secured a meeting. The HOA office looked like something straight out of the 80s, with heavy oak furniture and a potpourri scent that gave me a headache. Margaret received me with that same air of superiority. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your frustration, but rules are rules," she repeated like a mantra. When I asked about other similar cases, she slid a folder toward me. "Here's our violation history. As you can see, our decisions are consistent." I skimmed through the folder quickly, and something caught my eye. The Wilsons' house, just 3 blocks away, had a garage almost identical to mine. "Oh, that's a different case," Margaret dismissed with a wave. "They have special circumstances." On my way back to work, I passed by the Wilsons' house. I later found out that Robert Wilson was the cousin of the HOA treasurer. His garage was not only darker than mine, but it had been painted over a year ago. Work meetings became increasingly challenging. My mind would drift off into conspiracy theories when I should have been focused on deadlines and performance metrics. My developers noticed my distraction, and projects started falling behind. The breaking point came when I discovered that Margaret's own house had undergone a complete renovation the previous year, including a paint job in shades that clearly violated the very guidelines she defended. The hypocrisy was so blatant, it kept me up at night. That night, as I pored over programming code late into the evening, I realized I needed to tackle this problem like I did with bugs in the system. Investigate, document, and fix it methodically. It was time to stop reacting and start acting. The impact of this situation spread like a virus into my code. Emma, my 8-year-old daughter, came home from school in tears because her new best friend, Sarah Miller, could no longer play at our house. Her parents didn't want to be associated with rule breakers. At dinner, Emma poked her food with disinterest. "Dad, why don't we paint the garage white? Then nobody'll talk about us." Those words hit me like a punch. My daughter was suffering because of a ridiculous dispute over shades of gray. At work, things weren't much better. Silicon Valley might seem super progressive and modern, but when it comes to property, people turn out to be surprisingly conservative. During a meeting with investors, one of them pulled me aside and said, "I heard about your HOA problem. You know, this could affect your credibility as a leader." The neighbors split into two distinct groups. The younger ones, mostly tech professionals like myself, silently supported me. Some even started questioning other arbitrary HOA rules. But the older residents, led by Mrs. Peterson, treated me like a dangerous revolutionary. One day, I found an anonymous note in my mailbox. "You don't belong in this neighborhood. Sell your house and get out." The impeccable handwriting and scented paper gave me a pretty good idea who'd written it. Emma began having trouble sleeping. "What if they force us to move, Dad?" she asked every night. I hugged her tight, promising that wouldn't happen. But inside, I was consumed by worry. In the weekly company meetings, my mind wandered. While we discussed growth strategies and quarterly targets, I scribbled numbers in my notebook, calculating how long it might take to pay off that absurd fine if required. The atmosphere in the neighborhood grew tenser each day. Friendly smiles became replaced by suspicious glances. Even our morning walks with Emma became uncomfortable, as neighbors crossed the street just to avoid us. One Saturday, I organized a small birthday party for Emma. Only 3 kids showed up, each the child of another rebel in the neighborhood who was also questioning Margaret's regime. The last straw came when Emma was excluded from her neighborhood school's theater group. The official excuse was that all spots were taken, but I soon discovered that the program coordinator was a close friend of Margaret's. That night, sitting in the backyard watching my daughter play alone, I made a decision. I wasn't just fighting for a gray garage or abstract justice anymore. I was fighting for my daughter's right to grow up in a community that doesn't punish people for questioning arbitrary rules. The cost wasn't only financial, it was emotional, social, and professional. But every sad look from Emma, every hushed conversation in the office corridors, every anonymous letter only fueled my determination. I had to show that standing up to injustice doesn't make us outcasts, it makes us role models. During my sleepless nights, I started doing what I do best: analyzing data. I built a database with all the HOA decisions from the past 5 years. My programming experience allowed me to develop an algorithm to identify patterns in fines and approvals. The results were shocking. I created a heat map showing reported violations versus imposed fines. The inconsistencies were glaring. Homes belonging to Margaret's friends or board members had a modification approval rate 3 times higher than average. I uncovered leaked emails where Margaret discussed with other board members how to maintain the traditional character of the neighborhood and prevent Silicon Valley from transforming our community. In one particularly revealing exchange, she explicitly mentioned her discomfort with the influx of young tech professionals who don't respect our values. Using my data analysis skills, I built a digital timeline showing how the HOA rules were selectively enforced. For example, the Patterson house had an even darker color than mine, yet their fine was only $500. The difference? Mr. Patterson played golf with the association's vice president. I discovered that Margaret had digitally altered the approved shades 3 times in the last year, always right after approving projects from allies who broke the old rules. The most surprising revelation came when I accessed the city's public records. Margaret's own house had undergone 7 modifications in the past 3 years, each approved in record time, while similar projects by other residents were repeatedly denied. I created an interactive digital presentation, mapping each violation, each fine, each suspicious approval. The numbers didn't lie. There was a clear pattern of discrimination against new homeowners, especially those connected to the tech sector. On one particularly productive night, I found an archived email in which Margaret instructed her secretary to misplace certain renovation approval requests. Strangely enough, all the misplaced requests were from residents under 40. My investigation also revealed that the digital color meter used by the HOA had never been properly calibrated. In fact, the specific model they used had been discontinued for providing inconsistent readings. The final blow came when I discovered that Margaret had recently set up a consulting company that helped residents navigate the HOA approval process. For a fee, of course. It was a clear conflict of interest she had never disclosed. I organized all these findings into a complete digital dossier, with links to original documents, statistical analyses, and a clear chain of evidence. Every accusation was backed up by concrete and verifiable data. Sitting in my home office, Staring at the computer screen at 3 in the morning, I realized I held much more than just a defense against an unfair fine. I had evidence of an entire system designed to discriminate and control through arbitrary rules and selective enforcement. It was time to turn all that data into action. I needed someone who could translate this mountain of digital evidence into solid legal arguments. And, luckily, I knew just the person for that. Richard Harrison and I met at a tech meetup 3 years ago. Amid discussions about blockchain and artificial intelligence, we discovered a mutual interest in social justice. As a lawyer specializing in real estate law, he had already taken on cases against abusive HOAs. I set up a meeting with him at a cafe near the courthouse. As I unloaded my research, Richard's eyes lit up more and more. "Will, you didn't just build a case. You've got a nuclear bomb in your hands," he said, scrolling through the data on his tablet. We developed our strategy over several nights, combining my technical analysis with his legal expertise. Richard identified 3 important precedents in similar cases, but none with evidence as well documented as ours. "The key is showing the systematic pattern of discrimination," Richard explained as we refined our presentation. "Your data prove it's not just about a gray garage. It's about abuse of power and generational prejudice." We spent weeks preparing every detail of the case. Richard taught me to stay calm during our mock testimonies, even when he played a particularly provocative version of Margaret. "They're going to try and paint you as just an arrogant tech bro who doesn't respect tradition," he warned. "Don't fall for it." We built an interactive digital presentation for the courtroom, something Richard had never done before. "Most judges are used to plain paperwork and basic PowerPoints," he said. "Let's show them that technology can serve justice." Our initial request to the court was accepted with surprising speed. Judge Sarah Collins, known for her firm stance against corporate abuse, showed particular interest in the systematic aspect of our accusations. Richard worked tirelessly, turning my technical discoveries into rock-solid legal arguments. Every single line of code I had written to analyze the data became a piece of evidence. Every pattern my algorithm identified was transformed into a legal argument. News that we were suing the HOA quickly spread through the neighborhood. Other residents began coming to us with their own stories of abuse and discrimination. Richard collected testimonies, further strengthening our case. We prepared a layered defense. First, we would attack the legality of the fine imposed on my garage, then expand to show the broader pattern of discrimination, and finally unveil Margaret's consulting scheme. "We have to be strategic," Richard insisted. "It's not just about winning your case, it's about setting a precedent that protects others in the future." On the eve of the trial, we reviewed our strategy one last time. Richard had turned my cold data into a compelling narrative about abuse of power and systematic discrimination. My graphs and analyses now told a story anyone could understand. "Tomorrow," said Richard as he closed his laptop, "we're going to show that justice can be high-tech and human at the same time." I looked out the window of his office, watching the sun set over the city. For the first time in months, I felt we were on the verge of doing something truly important. I returned home that night with a renewed sense of purpose. Emma asked if I was nervous about the big day. "A little," I replied. "But sometimes you've got to fight for what's right, even when you're scared." The courtroom was more packed than we expected. Both young and old residents filled the seats, creating a clear physical divide that mirrored the tension in our community. Margaret sat with her lawyers, her posture as stiff as ever. Judge Collins entered the room, her eyes carefully examining every detail of our digital presentation. Richard kicked things off with a calm yet assertive voice. "This case isn't about a shade of gray. It's about systemic abuse of power and deliberate discrimination." When it was my turn to testify, I felt the weight of every gaze in the room. I took a deep breath and focused on explaining our data analysis in clear, plain language. Every point on this chart represents an HOA decision. The colors show a clear pattern of favoritism. Margaret's attorneys tried to discredit me, suggesting I was just a disgruntled programmer who didn't respect neighborhood traditions. "Mr. Thompson, don't you think you're using your tech expertise to complicate simple community rules?" one of them asked. I kept my cool, just as Richard had trained me. "No, Your Honor. I'm using technology to expose the truth. The numbers don't lie." I then presented our analysis of the faulty color meter, bolstered by a metrology expert who testified via video conference. The decisive moment came when Richard presented emails about Margaret's consulting company. The room erupted in murmurs. I saw her face go pale when her own lawyer called for a recess to consult with her. Margaret tried to defend herself, claiming her decisions were made to preserve the neighborhood's historic character. But every argument she made was systematically disproved by our data. Richard projected a timeline map showing how approvals perfectly coincided with personal connections and consulting payments. "Ms. Walker," Judge Collins interjected during one particularly tense moment, "how do you explain that homeowners who pay for your consulting get 100% approval on their modifications, while identical projects by others are denied?" The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret adjusted her blazer, and her mask of authority finally began to crack. Her lawyers whispered furiously while papers shuffled from one side to the other. Richard seized the moment by presenting our most impactful discovery: a statistical pattern proving discrimination against tech sector homeowners. The probability of this pattern occurring by chance is less than 0.01%, I explained as I projected the final graph. Margaret's defense crumbled when we presented testimonies from other residents. Every personal story brought the numbers and graphs to life, painting a devastating picture of years of manipulation and favoritism. In his closing remarks, Richard got straight to the point. "This case will set the precedent on whether we let prejudice and arbitrary power decide who belongs in a community." Judge Collins removed her glasses and looked directly at everyone in the courtroom. Her expression was solemn as she began to speak. The room fell silent, and I could feel Emma's tiny hand gripping mine tightly. Judge Collins's decision was clear and decisive. Not only was my fine overturned, but she also ordered a complete audit of the HOA and the immediate implementation of a new, transparent digital system for renovation approvals. "This court finds that there was a systematic pattern of discrimination and abuse of power," she declared, "and that the era of arbitrary rules and selective enforcement is over." Margaret remained motionless in her chair, her expression a mix of shock and outrage. The changes came fast and deep. Margaret was forced to resign, along with much of the board. A diverse group of residents, including tech professionals and longtime homeowners, was elected to lead the new administration. We developed an app that made every HOA decision transparent and traceable. Every request, every approval, every fine could now be seen in real time by all residents. The color code was simplified and standardized, with verifiable measurements and clear guidelines. That day, Emma came home with the biggest smile. "Sarah can come play here again," she announced, jumping for joy. The Wilsons, who once wouldn't even look our way, came over to congratulate us on our victory. At work, the story had an unexpected effect. My fight for justice, combined with the innovative use of technology to expose the truth, impressed not only my team, but also the executives. I was invited to lead a new initiative focused on transparency and tech ethics. Mrs. Peterson, the very one who crossed herself when she saw me, showed up at my door with a homemade cake. "You know," she said, "sometimes you need someone brave enough to show us that things can be different." The garage stayed its original shade of gray, now a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. Margaret put her house up for sale and moved to another state. Before leaving, I saw her looking at my garage one last time, perhaps finally realizing that her biggest loss wasn't losing control. It was never understanding that communities are built on respect, not arbitrary rules. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. The case quickly became a national example. Tech and real estate law journalists began publishing stories on how we use data analysis to fight discrimination in neighborhood associations. I received invitations to speak at conferences, sharing how technology can be a powerful tool in the fight against injustice. Our transparency app for HOAs was adopted by other communities. Richard and I started receiving messages from people all over the country facing similar situations. We decided to make the source code available for free, so other associations could implement their own transparent governance systems. Emma, now brimming with confidence, even started a coding club at school with her friends. "I want to help people just like you did, Dad," she told me one day while working on her first website. The pride I felt at that moment surpassed any legal victory. The changes in our community went beyond administrative matters. Neighborhood gatherings, once tense and formal, turned into real social events. Young programmers and longtime residents began exchanging experiences and knowledge. Even Mrs. Peterson asked for help setting up her first Instagram profile. A year after the decision, we organized a community street party. Children played in front of garages painted in different shades of gray, adults chatted about technology and gardening, and a new sense of belonging filled the air. The most gratifying part was seeing other communities follow our example. Our story sparked a wave of HOA reforms across the country. The integration of technology and community governance shifted from being seen as a threat to becoming a tool for unity and justice. Richard still jokes that we created a GitHub for community governance. Maybe he's right. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest disputes, or in our case, with a gray garage that became the symbol of something much greater. Now Emma says she wants to be a tech lawyer when she grows up. Just like you and Uncle Richard, she explains, but with more code. I smile, thinking that our little battle for justice may have inspired the next generation to keep fighting for fairer, more transparent communities. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this.